I'm hoping to talk about a topic that, of course, is whenever we talk about the Underground Railroad, we tend to refer to something that is often sort of hidden in shrouds of legend, and we don't really talk much about when it started or where it started, or particularly about the people involved beyond a kind of general sense. So what I hope to do tonight is to talk a bit actually about the Underground Railroad, but of course that is part of a bigger fascinating topic, and that is abolitionism. Now I know I'm in Missouri, and the topic, as you see there, is Illinois, so it says. But of course, if we're talking about abolitionism and the Underground Railroad, then we are talking about the two states, Missouri and Illinois, which of course they share a very long, significant border on the Mississippi River. So a little bit of background. First of all, I think probably you know a lot of this already. By the way, as I proceed, if you have questions or you want something clarified or something, please feel free to raise your hand. I know that there's going to be an after talk, open discussion, but I'm happy with it being a little more relaxed than that. So anyway, a little bit of background. You probably know, and I'm sure a lot of you are interested in the Civil War. The story of the Civil War and the coming of the Civil War is often told with a bit of an emphasis on what is happening in the East. Now, I'm from Iowa, so I have a chip on my shoulder. It's true. But I know I share that to some degree with Missourians, that we tend to get overlooked. And our role in the coming of the Civil War, ours as in this region, are often, obviously terribly significant. Out here we have John Brown operating, we have, the Dred Scott decision. So it's not that the western part of the United States was not important. And I think that's certainly true even early on. And so when people talk about the history of abolitionism, the coming of abolitionism, the early years of it, again, I think they tend to concentrate, I would argue, a bit too much on the East. Similarly, they tend to impose then, when they do talk about Illinois and Missouri, they impose conditions, circumstances that might be true in the East, that were actually quite different than the frontier out here. So I hope to reset that balance a little bit and shift that focus. Now, to start basically at the beginning, I think whenever we talk about the coming of the Civil War, one very quickly learns an awful lot by looking at the map of the Missouri Compromise and the fact that Missouri is this finger of slavery that points north into the north and is surrounded, eventually will be surrounded on three sides by so-called free states. So Missouri is a very interesting story, and so too, and we'll come to that in a minute, Illinois, of course, gets a pass, right? They can be proud that they are a free state now, looking back. But if you look actually at the history of Illinois, it's quite interesting. And their relationship to slavery, of course, initially they were settled in the South, especially by the French, who brought slaves. There was slavery in Illinois. When it was brought into the Union, they brought into the Union with the understanding that there would not be slavery here. But I think it's important to keep in mind what were the foundations, the reasons that the Illinoisans did not want slavery, and things like the Black Code, I'll tell you about that in a moment, I think are quite revealing that fundamentally Illinois did not want blacks in Illinois. And hence they were opposed to slavery. Now you can see in the South there was slavery that eventually was basically grandfathered out. There were still slaves there all the way up to the 1840s. So they still were there, but there were various kinds of ways that the state orchestrated this sort of continuation of a kind of slavery. They called it other things, of course. The Black Code, which was put in place in 1818, and then it was revised several times thereafter, as late as 1848, the Constitutional Convention, that made Illinois' black code, which was designed to limit blacks' entry into Illinois, amongst, if not the most restrictive in the nation. So very, very harsh. What do I mean by harsh? A freed black, if they chose to enter into Illinois, had to deposit a huge amount of money, I'm thinking $500, with the county seat. And if they did not leave within a certain amount of time, they were fined. If they could not pay their fine, the fine kept going up. And eventually, if they could not pay their fine, did not leave when they were supposed to leave, or were seen somehow as a problem to the society, the community, they could be sold, and half the money go to the person who turned them in, and the other half presumably going to the county. This is Illinois, right? So the Illinois shouldn't be too self-righteous in this story. So slavery, let's talk about Missouri and how it fits into that story. When we think about slavery, and of course, I don't know about you, I grew up with that blasted movie, Gone with the Wind, and variations on that. When we think about slavery, we think about plantation life quite often. And the map here is the map of the southern United States, and you can see where the concentration, the darker the map, the more concentration of slavery. And that is true, varied a bit, but you certainly get plantation slavery in the South. What you don't get is plantation slavery in Missouri. And notice, you can see on this map, the concentration of slavery in Missouri is actually limited to along the rivers. Very few slaves in southern Missouri, and a surprisingly large number in northern Missouri. We'll zero in on that a little bit more, and you can see from this map the concentration of slaves. And notice the darkest part are 30% of the total population in that county were in fact enslaved. So you can see, especially along the Missouri River, but surprisingly, very far north, right along the Mississippi River. These two counties right here, Marion and Lewis County, which we're going to be talking about a bit tonight, we know that Marion County, 1 in 4 were enslaved, and in Lewis County, about 1 in 5. Now, what did this slavery look like? This is not plantation areas at all. It looks like Missouri slavery tended to be small farmers with 2 to 5 slaves. Very different than the plantation. And a very different sort of experience of slavery. Much smaller scale, more direct interaction between the enslavers and the enslaved in Missouri. A different sort of experience than the rest of the South. It shouldn't surprise us that when the Civil War comes, the Missourians choose to follow a kind of different path, don't they? By staying in the Union so they can keep their slaves and they think they can get away with it. And they almost do for a while. So we're going to look tonight, especially at this northeast corner. But before we go on, I think this is also part of the story. When we talk about the coming of abolitionism, there's no question that it evolves over time. It also, all the way up to the Civil War, abolitionism represents a kind of range, a rainbow of different attitudes towards the ending of slavery. Early on, and this was actually an option right up into the Civil War, you might call them people who thought they were opposed, a kind of abolitionism light. I'm not sure that quite works, but they sort of justified it by saying that the way to end slavery, and they would say slavery must eventually end here, it's a bad thing. They would argue that the way to end slavery would be to buy the slaves, the enslaved, from the enslavers, and then, along with freed blacks, and then ship them to Africa, Liberia, Sierra Leone. It was very popular. Abraham Lincoln, notably, was in favor of it, right up until just before the Emancipation Proclamation. And a lot of people actually took that very seriously. Pretty early on, especially the black abolitionists, who played a major role in the story of abolitionism in the eastern part of the United States, were adamantly opposed to this and saw it as racist, which indeed it was. And so this was all a possibility. And in Missouri, if there were, and there were abolitionists here, they had to be really, really careful what they said, and I will show you that in a minute. But if they were, they tended to be of this variety of colonizationists. And even then, they were often quite cautious. And then we'll find, as we move from the 1830s to the 1850s, there are fewer and fewer and fewer Missourians who would dare come out in favor of even this kind of abolitionism. Right? The coming of the Civil War, interesting enough, early on, Missourians were sort of willing to entertain the possibility that it might be a bad thing. With the coming of and the tensions involved around abolitionism and the national debate going on, and a growing paranoia that kicks in the 40s and 50s. By the time we get to the Civil War, abolitionism is seen as an absolute evil thing. So this is kind of makes the point. I think that's really when one tries to understand the coming of the Civil War and what actually prompted these neighboring states to start killing each other. I think so much of it is a kind of growing tit for tat, in which you get some abolitionist activities and then you get a reaction, and often the reaction is exaggerated, and then the abolitionist response perhaps is exaggerated, and then the response by slave owners is itself exaggerated. A good example, you can see this little section I took from one of the Missouri papers, and it talks about slave stampedes. And the stampede was a massive runaway, often kind of associated with slave revolts, and oftentimes these things appear in the paper as if there were 30, 40, 50 slaves running away. As far as we can tell, rarely were they more than 10 to 11. But this is the environment of overstating and overreaction that we see in this period. Okay, so to zero in to the movement from abolitionism to action, to direct action, to encouraging slaves to run away, that is part of the story here, and even the Underground Railroad, a good case study is in western Illinois, across from Lewis and Marion counties that I showed you here earlier, right around the Quincy area, but also including Jacksonville and to some degree Alton's further south. But especially, we have some very interesting things that we can say as a sort of case study in how this came into being in the Quincy area. It concentrates, and this is very typical of abolitionism. We can begin the story with David Nelson. And David Nelson, very typical early abolitionist, he was, as was true of most of them, and I'm going to put my watch here to make sure I don't talk too much, which, as you probably can tell, I can. David Nelson was an incredibly dynamic Presbyterian evangelist, revivalist, and this was the great age of the Second Great Awakening, of course, and the nation was swept with religious fervor, and he was very much part of that. Incredibly dynamic, powerful, 6-foot, barrel-chested man, and inspiring. Originally a slave owner who released his slaves, had a conversion experience during the War of 1812. He was a physician, then moved to Marion County, Missouri. Right, so back to this, just to show you where we're talking about here. Marion County is right up here. Right? So he's in the northeast corner of Missouri. And he is determined to, this of course is the frontier, he's determined to arrive on the frontier and to found a college to train young men to go out and convert souls and save the soul of the nation. And he arrives and he's got his doubts about abolitionism, very typical of the age. Not sure what he thinks of it, but slavery surely will fade away. So he arrives in an area near Palmyra. This is Marion County, so we're zeroing in. And he attempts to start a college. It had great expectations. This was going to be the Harvard of the West. And the major investors, actually serious investment, the kind of investment modern colleges, small colleges would be delighted to have. And this was going to be Marion College. And so he founded it in 1831, not far from the Mississippi River. And it's going to be what were called, and they were popular at the time, manual labor schools. This was all part of this great age of reform in the 19th century. He wanted to offer education to ordinary folks. Higher education was mostly limited to the upper classes. A manual labor college, based on the idea, I think there's still maybe one left in the United States, that students actually work their way to pay tuition so that anybody can go. And that's the idea behind this. They're very hard to succeed. Part of the feature was, of course, that the students would work under their professors out in the fields during the morning, and then they would maybe study in the afternoon. And for some reason, I can't imagine why that didn't work very well. But anyway, it didn't work very well. But he had a good try of it in the 18th, as you can see, and it had a pretty good run. Quite a number of students moved in there. If you go to where the college was today, it is completely gone. It's in a little town called Philadelphia. It was actually founded as the college town, and the town is still there, but the college buildings, such as they were, are completely gone. So he goes there and he starts this college. He doesn't sound like a very good teacher. I think he's distracted a lot, of course, going out and doing tent revivals. But anyway, the college starts up, and he is, as a Presbyterian, of course, he participates in Presbyterian governance, in the synod, and in one of these occasions actually sits in the presence of a great early abolitionist, Theodore Well, a name we should probably know better than we do. And Theodore Well, incredibly dynamic. I think that picture, from what I've read, captures his personality perfectly. And very early on, he is one of the earliest to embrace the idea of immediate emancipation. And this is pretty early. So we're talking about 1834, 35, very early. At this point, the nation is just aware of abolitionism, but they are just crackpots on the edge. They're not a very serious group, and it's going to be gradual anyway. It's going to be a slow process. Well says no, it needs to be happening right now. And he converts David Nelson into the same position, same point of view. Nelson goes back to Missouri, and we credit Nelson actually with converting Eliza Lovejoy. And of course, as Missourians, across the river from Alton, you know about Eliza Lovejoy, really the first martyr to the cause of abolitionism. Newspaper man in St. Louis, goes through lots of presses. He's close to the river, so when a mob doesn't like what he publishes and he's pro-abolitionism, they of course dump the printing press in the river, and this happens 3 or 4 times. He crosses to Alton. He should have known better than to locate close to the river, because sure enough, they dump his press repeatedly in the river there, and eventually, of course, we know he gets killed. Anyway, he is converted to abolitionism by David Nelson. So there is that link then between early abolitionism in the North and the key newspaper in making the case for abolitionism in St. Louis. Eliza Lovejoy, lots of enemies, very unpopular figure, and as I said, at this point, Missouri is not quite as opposed to abolitionism as it later will be, but certainly is not enthusiastic about it. 1836, an important year in American history. We know about the gag rule that actually was an attempt to stop abolitionist activities in Congress. And of course, we have William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. You see a page there, more and more calling for the end of slavery, immediate end of slavery. You have publications like, you can see the anti-slavery record and the slave's friend, and so they're producing these kinds of things. In 1836, some of these documents find their way to Marion College, Missouri. And at that time, there are a couple, we may call them agents of the Anti-Slavery Society. Anyway, students probably at Marion College, and they are caught trying to smuggle these documents into Missouri. And they are lucky to get out of there with their skin intact. Tar and feathering would have been an appropriate response, so the mob thought. And a major feature, almost an actor, almost a separate actor in the story of abolitionism and Underground Railroad and anti-slavery activity, is the mob. It was an age in which a lot of Americans believed that the way to practice their good civic engagement and citizenship was to participate in mob activity. It was seen as a kind of purest, natural expression of democracy. And they would have argued that. And of course what that meant, of course you can imagine burning down houses and throwing presses into the Mississippi River and killing people indeed. And all those things were part of it. The mob chases Garrett and Williams across the river into Quincy, right? Directly across the river. Quincy is the town of any size, it's about 1,000 in 1836. At the same time, in these piles of paper, they also find some material written by our man, David Nelson, in which, sure enough, it reveals his conversion to abolitionism. So he is seen now from the perspective of the Missourians in Marion County. Remember, 1 in 4 of the population are enslaved, as a serious abolitionist. There is a celebrated event in which there's a kind of riot. Nelson tries to give a sermon and actually is trying to raise money for the Colonization Society, but that causes an explosion. People charge the lectern. There is a fist fight. There's a knife fight. Blood is spilled, and Nelson is really lucky to get out of there. And he barely escapes across the Mississippi River with the mob howling at his heels. Famously, well-known evangelist, he wrote lots of hymns, so there's even a hymn, supposedly, that he wrote when he was hiding out in the reeds along the Mississippi River that became a popular hymn in the Civil War. Supposedly it was written while he was escaping. But anyway, yes, yeah.
What's the name of the song?
It is The Shining Shore. Walt Whitman mentions hearing it sung in Union Army hospitals. It's a beautiful thing, actually. If you go online and want to hear what it sounds like, it should be better known than it is. And he wrote several of them. He was kind of a poet in general. So Nelson slips across the river into Quincy, and there he actually encounters a very small, very tiny number of abolitionists. I think that's the thing to keep in mind when we talk about abolitionism. Really well up into the late 1850s, abolitionism is always a minority, even a small minority. We probably should call them radicals. And so Nelson escapes. There are a few similar radical abolitionists. Asa Turner over there is one of them. They receive Nelson. The rioting continues, actually. The mob from Marion County, Missouri, crosses the river into Quincy in pursuit. Meanwhile, we've already pointed out the Illinoisans are not all that crazy about abolitionists either, are they? And they similarly, he's besieged in a hotel at one point while the mob, both from Missouri and Illinois, are trying to throw him out. But eventually the mob withdraws. After a while, the prospect, I think they develop a thirst, and they often need to go off to the taverns and sort of get their voices back. Nelson establishes himself in Illinois. In other words, has been driven by fear of death from Missouri and flees into Illinois. While he's there, as I say, he meets up with other radical abolitionists there, and they form the Illinois State Anti-Slavery Society. The 19th century, mid-19th century, was the great age of belonging to organizations and passing resolutions. And it made people feel very good about passing the often very self-righteous, not altogether practical resolutions. But there was this Illinois State Anti-Slavery Society formed in November of 1837. Nelson was there. Other people from the radical abolitionists in the state also were there. And the secretary was Eliza Lovejoy. This, of course, happened just a month before, in fact, we know that he was shot and killed. Lovejoy was widely criticized because he actually was fighting back, and this was seen as inappropriate. The abolitionists definitely determined to pursue a pacifist orientation, and Lovejoy wasn't ready to do that. And so he actually was shooting back when he, in fact, was shot and killed. So this is just as the Anti-Slavery Society in the state is forming. So now we move to a state organization, and they lose one of their key figures. It's very, very troubling. Meanwhile, Nelson goes on to found another college, right? Clearly, Marion County, he's lost control of that, and it continues to have a bit of a life for a while. And he founds the Mission Institute in Quincy, and this is designed to train missionaries, but it is also a hotbed of abolitionism. To the point that when you look at the documents for this, Nelson was a very early abolitionist, always felt a little bit more sympathy for slave owners, maybe, having been one himself. His students, many of them actually coming in from Oberlin and places further east, were much less sympathetic to a sort of notion of gradual emancipation and actually determined to really, I think we could actually call them actually radical abolitionists. In fact, amongst the most radical in the nation. We have then, from this Mission Institute, as far as we know, the first, or at least among the first, attempts by abolitionists in this case, Quincy. These are two students and an employee of the college, George Thompson, Allison Work, James Burr. They decide that they're sick and tired of the slavery they see just across the river in Missouri, and so one night in July, they decide to go across and to do the unthinkable, to actually find slaves and persuade them to run away. Unheard of. 1841. So this is a long time before this all leads to Civil War. They cross the river, they actually find slaves, they tell them that they're going to come back across in a couple nights with a boat and carry them to freedom. The slaves hear these guys and they have never heard of such a thing. Now, it's not that slaves were not running away in Missouri. They certainly were. So we have records of runaways well into the 1830s, usually running away, always running away by themselves. I think there tends to be a sort of notion of inflating the role of people on Underground Road. An awful lot of this was runaways with the guts to leap into the dark and take off on their own. So there certainly was that going on, but there was very little sense, there was no sense of any kind of help really in Illinois. Running away even wasn't all that good an idea in the North until Canada finally outlawed slavery, and that was not until 1834, and they really weren't, it wasn't put in place until 1840. So running away to Canada was not really an option until beginning right around about this time, right around about the 1840s. So the slaves that these three encountered had never heard of anybody helping, certainly whites, helping them run away. They had not heard of Canada, probably. Not surprisingly, they pretended to go along, and then they went back to their enslavers and told them, these are slave catchers, right? These are, or slave kidnappers, and that was something that actually occurred. As though you had, apparently there were whites who were involved in the slave trade who might pose as interested in helping runaways, and in fact just did the opposite, sold them downriver, which was the unspeakable thing always as far as Missouri slaves are concerned. So when these three guys came across, they were caught, they were hauled to the Palmyra jail, and there was a celebrated case, court case. At this point, of course, Missouri had no laws on the books to deal with this. How do you try people, they call it secreting slaves? There's nothing on the books. So these guys were actually charged with grand larceny for stealing property. That was as close as they could come to finding something to charge them with. They were sent to, guess where? Jefferson City Penitentiary, which I understand is still here. Is that right? Or parts of the original one? Which I need to have a look at some point. And in fact, they were convicted and sentenced to 12 years. And of course, this became a celebrated case in the nation. You can imagine the abolitionists newspapers saw this as absolutely outrageous. Here you have these saintly men trying to help runaways, or in turn, you have these abolitionist demons trying to persuade good, honest slaves to leave their kindly masters. Right? So this was quite an important thing. We know a lot about this because George Thompson wrote a book describing his prison experience. It describes this whole adventure with the slaves, and it goes into 8 or 9 printings. It's a very, very popular book alongside, and of course later on we kind of get through Uncle Tom's Cabin tends to dominate our notion of what people read. But there was already literature like this well before that. So we have this version, which is exceptional because one of the great challenges with writing anything about early abolitionism or writing anything about runaways or writing anything about the Underground Railroad is the problem of sources. This is, after all, top secret. You could get in serious trouble, helping, very serious trouble, lynched potentially. So it's tough. So we have a brief occasion where we actually have some information about this. This is an important turning point in the development of the Underground Railroad. So at this point, we don't really have an Underground Railroad yet, right? We have these 3 students doing the unthinkable of crossing the river into Missouri. We have a lot of resolutions being passed by societies calling about the evils of slavery, and we must do something about it. So let's pray really hard to end slavery. And that certainly goes on for a long time. But I think we can zero in on this Thompson work and Burr affair as a bit of a turning point. Particularly shocking, the punishment outrageous. So many people, even in Missouri, were sort of sympathetic that these are just boys. You're sending them to prison for 12 years? It's just appalling. And so this kind of response to this event prompts an interesting activity in the churches. When you look at where the abolitionists were, many of them, obviously, their activity revolved around the church. Presbyterian, but especially Congregationalists, were active in anti-abolitionism, many of them from the East. And after the Thompson work and Burr affair, you get these interesting references to these things called concert of prayers in the Illinois abolitionist movements. And they are kind of just what they're described, where the community gets together and prays very hard and gives speeches and thinks hard about what we should do. And it's very interesting when you look at the language coming out of these concerts of prayers. They are moving quite overtly from praying really hard to actually, they don't say we're going to help runaways, but almost praying to we're going to take action. We have had enough. They're a little vague about it, but it can't be a coincidence. It's at this point that we start seeing genuine Underground Railroad activity. And these congregational churches are right smack in the middle of it. So these concert of prayers, I think we can make the case that they are a key part in the development of this. In Quincy, where I live, we have a Underground Railroad museum. And again, we are lucky in that we have documents. There are lots of myths around Underground Railroad sites. In this case, there was a doctor living in Quincy who was keen and big in the Congregationalist movement and a key figure in the Underground Railroad, very early Underground Railroad. We're still trying to figure out what exactly happens. But he may have been set up by Missourians because they already knew that he was helping runaways. So on an August night, a man runaway, only known to us as Charlie, who may have been a runaway or he may have been put up to it by slave owners. In any case, Dr. Eels takes Charlie, gives him dry clothes, puts him in the back of his very fast buggy, and he's got a famously fast horse, appropriately named White Lightning. With White Lightning with the whip, Dr. Eels takes Charlie across town to the Mission Institute, where already there is a structure in place to move Charlie to Mendon, which is a town beyond that, which already has well-established safe houses. We're dealing with relationships, not roots. So Eels knows of good people there who know of good people beyond who can help Charlie get away. However, this is where it becomes suspicious. There are people all around Dr. Eels' house from Missouri watching him, expecting him to take off. They, of course, catch him in the act. So this goes, he is fined $500. It goes to the Illinois Supreme Court. He loses. Eventually it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, this is the same Supreme Court that will make the Dred Scott decision later on, of course, comes down on the side of the slave owners. And Dr. Eels, in fact, though he gets good counsel, William Seward was his lawyer. Nevertheless, he basically wears himself out, dies a few years after this, trying to undo this court case and loses. After this event, we get into the mid-1840s. There's kind of an uptick of Underground Railroad activity. That is a point where it really looks like it's taking off. But we know that nationally we have the Fugitive Slave Law coming in 1850. As far as we can tell, and again, of course, we're dealing with very few good sources. There's a sense that the Underground Railroad was very active in the 40s and then kind of slopes off into the 50s and 60s. But I am out of time, and that is a good place to stop.